So much for the introduction. Yeah, thanks for being over here. So today I'm just gonna give you a quick overview of what my project is and how I've used the fantastic collections at the Western to carry out my research. So first of all, I'm just gonna give you a quick overview, right? So I'm writing a book right now, my first one, right, based on my DPhil thesis, right? And it's really about how coastal cities in Southeast Asia were integral to things like imperial expansion, the infiltration of colonial capitalism, and things like environmental change and degradation, especially in Borneo, right? So my project ranges from the period 1879 to 1942, and it's about this state formerly known as British North Borneo, right? So I know the title of the presentation says Borneo, but I focus on a very specific part of it, the northern part of it, right? It is now known today as Sabah, and it's a state in East Malaysia, right? So in case, just to orientate everybody, I'll flip the map around, right? So this is a map of the region we now know as Southeast Asia, and Borneo really kind of like sits at the geographical heart of this region over here. One thing you might want to notice is, about this map is that, well, it's like from 1908, right? And the map isn't titled the Map of Southeast Asia. It's titled India and the East, right? Because the term Southeast Asia only really comes about in official use during the Second World War. So in the intervening period, in the period before that, it's kind of known as this in-between place, right? Between India and, the East, and so on and so forth. Now, what does Sabah or North Borneo look like exactly? There's a map over here produced in, I think, 1909. That shows you kind of like the terrain and different features of Sabah itself. My work focuses on two cities in Sabah. That's Sassoon on the western coast that was founded in 1899, and the other is Sandakan on the eastern coast, founded in 1879. You might be also wondering, like, what do these two places look like in the era that I'm studying them? There are some photographs and postcards over here that give you a sense of what these places looked like also. They were kind of like tucked between two different ecological zones, right? On the edges of Borneo, they were between the sea and then obviously the jungle itself that comes up very close to these cities. They were also small, very multi-ethnic societies. When I first applied to use the collections at the Western, I really came here expecting to look at, things like personal papers, correspondence, diaries, autobiographies, right, of personalities associated with the state of North Borneo, right? I expected to find something related to, a glimpse of what social life, right, in some of these cities might have looked like. And there are these things in the Western, of course. But then I came across this collection, this entire collection of files by the Anti-Slavery Society that is kept at the Western, and it really kind of changed the direction of what I wanted to do at the Western over here, right? I found stacks of letters, correspondence, allegations, evidence of widespread abuses of indigenous land rights in Sabah itself, right? Carried out by plantation companies and by the colonial government, especially on the western coast of Sabah over there, right? That's Chesterton and then the hinterland down south from over there. These materials really dovetail with an aspect of my research that relates to how urban centers, right, the cities that we live in, really were instrumental to the process of changing and altering environments and landscapes, right, that they were embedded in, right? They were first connected. You have kind of like a colonial urban settlement, right? And these places were linked to the interior by roads, by railways, so on and so forth. And on these transport routes, right, you have a whole host of different agents, right, that came into the interior to do what? Well, basically you have surveyors, right, who mapped out plots of land into, saleable plots, right? Things that would sell to plantation companies. You had capitalists that came in and financed the construction and maintenance of plantation estates, so on and so forth. And then, of course, you have colonial police, right, coming in to quash resistance if they encountered it, so on and so forth. So this is kind of these files over here, just some of from the collection of the Anti-Slavery Society, some of the files that the Western keeps, right? And for the North Borneo government in particular, getting companies to come into Sabah to develop rubber plantations on the land, right, was something that they were keenly interested in, especially at the beginning of the 20th century on the western coast, right? This was a period of what some people call the rubber boom, right? A great increase in demand for rubber as kind of like a plantation crop, right, to fuel industry, across the world, so on and so forth. Over here, you'll find a handbook written by the government detailing what kind of people and what kind of companies they wanted to attract to Sabah specifically. It basically tells people in Britain, and this little booklet over here was meant to be read by people in this country. It basically says like, if you don't have anything close to £6,000, don't bother coming, because there's nothing for you to do over here in Sabah, right? They wanted people with sufficient capital to come and invest in Sabah, right, to build rubber plantations and companies, so on and so forth. And you can kind of imagine this sort of like rush, right, led to all sorts of land grabbing, right? All sorts of like disregards for lands traditionally held by indigenous people who lived on the western coast, and these were Dusun peoples. The Dusun people are an Austronesian ethnic group that basically live on the western coast of Sabah. And what's interesting is that the majority, a great deal of these letters, right, were written by one former North Borneo colonial official, right? His name was Reginald Bryant Turner, and he was a graduate of Oxford. And between 1908 to 1909, he was basically a judicial commissioner in Sabah. And he was he was forced to resign because he basically spoke up for plantation laborers, and the government didn't like that. What he did instead, next, right, was to run a private practice in Sabah itself. He was allowed to do that, but he further incurred the wrath of the government when he decided to, again, kind of like speak up for the plight of the Dusun peoples on the western coast. And he tried to kind of like represent them against the rubber companies, and kind of like explain quickly later, but it didn't end well, right? So what were some of these allegations of like land rights abuses? You can see very briefly from that letter over there, but these can be categorized into three general categories, right? First, the appropriation of lands without consent, or in some cases compensation. The desecration and sometimes the destruction of local graveyards. And also, basically the cutting down of like fruit trees and orchards, right, used by some of these communities as well. One of the most interesting things I found in the collection is basically these three letters written in Malay by three members of these different Dusun communities on the western coast over here. You will find that the handwriting is remarkably similar, and I suspect that's because the local Roman Catholic mission had a representative to help draft these letters for them. So you'll find these letters over here. There's a if you don't read Malay, there's also a translation in English over there of one of the letters. Yeah. The Western is also interesting in that it contains railway and land surveys, right, of Sabah itself. So over here you can see how different parts of the western coast were kind of surveyed, right? And part of the job of surveyors, right, is not only to come up with these plans, but to like figure out how to divide them. Because of the proximity, because of kind of the ease of transport, right, rubber companies usually prefer to build their estates and plantations along the railway, and you can kind of like see that over here as well. So, just gonna try to like briefly conclude, right? So despite the efforts of people like Reginald Turner, Dusun petitioners, and then also the other supporters, right? Land disputes were not resolved in favor of the Dusun people, right? In 1910, right, they actually brought the North Borneo government to court, right, within the territory itself, right, over these land disputes, right, over a failure to protect their land rights from encroachment by rubber companies. But you can kind of guess how that went, right? This was a case that was presided over in a court, right? with a judge that was appointed by the government itself. So, needless to say, the judgment didn't end in their favor. So the rubber companies and the government kind of like, won that court case. In places like Sabah, in colonial North Borneo, as with other parts of the colonized world, the development of plantation agriculture basically took precedence over the protection of indigenous rights, whether in land or in other cases as well. Now, we rarely think of plantation agriculture and the erosion of indigenous land rights, right, as part of an urban process, right? But they were. These were kind of like intensely urban related processes as well, right? They were driven by metropolitan impulses and demands, right? They were executed by agents in colonial settlements and cities that aided in gathering, supplying, and supporting the men and companies like those in Borneo's environment. Thanks for being here. If you have any questions, please, I'll stay back and please feel free to ask, right? Thank you for your time.